Before, generator scheduling and dispatch involved these following steps. First, they had to inform generators had to inform their availability for the next day. They are expected to project their capability, which is not that difficult for conventional plants such as coal and natural gas because they have fuel stock. So they really know what their capacities would be the next day. However, it's more difficult for hydro plants to project their capability tomorrow because they have to estimate the level of water in if it's a stock dam. They have to anticipate weather and daily maximum water output. Particularly, that is very important for multipurpose hydro plants, which at the same time, aside from providing generation output, they also have to ensure that they don't produce that much, because if they produce a lot of power, it means they have to release a lot of water. And one of the purposes of those multi-purpose dam is for irrigation for some of the rice fields here in the country. So if they release a lot of water, crops may be flooded, and you will lose a season. Uh, you will lose that crop season if they get flooded. So they have to ensure that they only release a maximum water output, which is also equivalent to a maximum generation output for a day. Generating plants should also provide their generation rate based on their production costs as info. So as input to the planners, how do they schedule those generators? They have to schedule it at the cheapest rate. So they have to have info on how much that production from those plants would be, so that the appropriate and obviously sufficient capacities are scheduled for dispatch for the next day. Now, the system operator has to, again, this is back then, has to forecast the megawatt demand requirement for each hour of the next day. Okay. Uh, once they've done that, they have to match. Obviously, they have to schedule now the generators that declared their availability to eventually reach the demand requirement for each hour of the next day. So first, they will have to schedule R1. For R1, let's say there's like 10,000 megawatts. Now I have a generation capacity that was declared for me around 14,000 megawatts. So obviously that generation capacity of 14,000 is sufficient enough to cover for the 10,000. Now I have to schedule which ones to schedule for the 10,000 out of the 14,000. I can't schedule all of them because that will create obviously an over frequency. You have to just match the forecasted demand with the generation that should be scheduled out of that available capacity. So how do they schedule? Again, they schedule based on the least cost back then. Obviously, that's the appropriate thing to do. They schedule generators at least at their PMIN. Now, what is PMIN? PMIN is the minimum stable loading of generators, which refers to the minimum megawatt level a generator should be operating in a continuous manner. Okay, so these are practically for conventional plants or are typically for conventional generator plants. When I say conventional, these are thermal plants that use heat to eventually drive uh, or to produce steam and eventually drive the turbines for us to have generation output. So a generator, let's relate it to a car. When you're driving a car, you have to maintain a certain speed or a minimum speed when you're driving or when you're moving. So it's the same with generators. There should be a minimum output, which is actually equivalent to a minimum speed as well when they are running. So that's Pmin. Now you have to select generators. Now once you schedule generators Pmin, let's say going back to the example, we have 10,000 megawatts and you have a capacity of 14,000. That's your maximum capacity. Now, out of the 14,000, let's say I have a payment of 5,000, let's say 6,000 megawatts. Now, that already covers that 6,000 megawatts I have to schedule already. Okay. So, out of the 10,000, I'm already committing 6,000 megawatts because they're PMIN. Okay. I cannot schedule a generator below their PMIN. Now, once I have that 6,000, I only have the remaining 4,000 megawatts to schedule, right? So for that 4,000, how do I select which ones to eventually schedule further? And that will be based, again, from the inputs that were provided earlier, which is their cost or their production cost. So which is the cheapest? I'll schedule the generator with the cheapest generation rate and eventually move up and eventually fill up the 10,000 megawatt until we meet that forecast megawatt demand requirement for that hour. And then I'll repeat that process for the next hour and for the rest of the hours for that day. Now the system planner has to consider also the ramp rates of the generators. Now if a generator, let's say, is running 3 megawatts per minute, okay, in an hour, that's 180 megawatts in an hour. So I can't just schedule a generator. Let's say he was on shutdown on R1, then I suddenly schedule him at 300 megawatts. That will be impossible for that generator to meet. Aside from starting up, if we neglect that other factors such as the as a startup operation, if you look at it, he cannot reach 0 to 300 in an hour because again, his ramp rate is only 3 megawatts per minute. Okay, and that's the same as going down. If I'm already at 300 megawatts for, let's say, R4, and then suddenly you want me to be scheduled at 50 megawatts, again, that would be difficult for that generator to go down from 300 to 50 if the ramp rate again is 3 megawatts per minute. So the planner back then has to consider those ramp rates. Now, once I have the schedules and physically or technically they are, again, they match the demand requirements forecasted for each hour. At the same time, I am not violating any ramp rate capabilities from R to R for each generator. The system planner back then will now have to perform some power flow analysis on the generator schedules obtained in that step, okay, while considering obviously the load requirements for each area or for each substation or node, and at the same time considering what are the power system constraints, such as obviously the capacities of the line where power will flow, and then at the same time voltage stability. In performing power flow analysis, we assign generator mega schedules to their locations, including the projected locational load requirements in a projected snapshot of the power system for the next day. Now, there's a lot of software that is being used, so the system planner will execute the power flow analysis. If there are transformers or line overloadings or voltage problems, the planner now has to determine which generators affect those overloadings or have and if for, let's say, for transformer or line overloadings, have to schedule the generator that's affecting that line or that's overloading the line. You have to push back its schedule down, and eventually you have to find another generator which you have to increase to recover that generation that was scheduled down, so that you alleviate the problem of the congestion due to the overloading. If it's a voltage issue, obviously you have to find the appropriate generator. If there's megavar output available, you can always use that. But if there's none, you have to find the appropriate generator which can mitigate the voltage issue. And that will, because you're increasing, let's say again, my demand is 10,000 already, and my schedules are already up to 10,000. If I have to increase someone by, let's say, 50 megawatts, I have to decrease obviously another generator by around that value of 50 megawatts as well. Lastly is the planner has to schedule ancillary services again for the next day. So ancillary services are divided into two types, which are frequency control ancillary services and reactive support and black start services.